Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Good evening. Welcome to the History Department's Frost Lecture of 2022. I want to begin my remarks. Well, first of all, I should say that I'm Bill Smaldone, and I'm the chair of the History Department. And I wanted to begin my remarks tonight by reminding everyone that the Frost Lecture of 2020 was the last major in-person event for the History Department. I remember, in fact, very clearly that night, we had our guest speaker, we went to a nice dinner. The news was coming in, about this COVID thing, and Ellen Eisenberg, our colleague, was running around the restaurant telling us, don't shake hands. And we all looked at her rather oddly, But, she knew what was going on, and pretty soon, as we all know, things were shut down. So, it is fitting that the Frost Lecture of 2022 is the History Department's first major in-person event of what we hope will soon be the post-COVID era. Yay! So, that brings me really to an explanation of what this Frost Lecture business is all about. And that is that the History Department every year gets to organize a talk by a well-known scholar on some issue of interest. And this is all made possible by the generosity of Alan and Fran Frost. It's their generosity that makes the event possible. Unfortunately, this year, the Frosts could not attend in person, but I know that they are watching on Zoom. I hope that they are relaxed and drinking a glass of wine, Oregon wine, I hope. And I would like to ask everyone in the audience if they would please give a round of applause in appreciation for the support from the Frost family. Also, I would like to thank several people who were really important for organizing this event. First of all is Raina Myers, who is the administrative assistant in Eaton Hall. Second, we have Kyle House, who is with WITS, who is the technical whiz who makes this all possible. And then we have Kimberly Harper Hankin from the advancement unit. Without them, this would have been much more difficult to put together, and I want to also offer them a round of applause, thanking them for their help. All right, and now we come to our main event. So the History Department is very pleased to have as our speaker this evening, Radhika Natarajan. And Professor Natarajan comes to us from Reed College. She completed her PhD in history at the University of California, Berkeley. And she's an assistant, soon to be associate professor in history and the humanities at Reed. At Reed, Professor Natarajan teaches a wide range of courses on the history of race, ethnicity, and migration in the British Empire. Her research specializes in post-1945 migration to Great Britain, and she has published widely on that subject. Tonight, she's going to share with us some of the most recent fruits of that research in her talk bearing the title, Empire and the Origins of Multiculturalism, Migration, Citizenship, and Rights in Post-War Britain. So I please welcome Professor Natarajan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. And I just really want to add my thanks to Bill's, to you for the invitation, to Raina and Kyle for making this talk possible. I just had such a wonderful day today talking with students in the department and with faculty just up the road on the 5, but somehow it feels far between Portland and Salem. So I was really happy to make the trip down today. So I'm going to be sharing a little bit about my research about the imperial origins of multiculturalism today. But I want to start in the present. In 2018, the Windrush Scandal broke in Britain and revealed the precarious nature of post-imperial citizenship for migrants from the former empire. From 2015, the British Home Office maintained a hostile environment policy, that was their language, which targeted migrants who were in the country illegally at their homes, their places of employment, and welfare agencies. The border became embedded in all aspects of daily life. Although anti-European Union sentiment inspired the formation of this policy, the government's actions targeted areas that were mostly settled by migrants from South Asia and the Caribbean, areas that had once been part of the British Empire. Specifically, the government investigated and detained Afro-Caribbean Britons who had arrived in the 1960s on their parents' passports. Without documentation to prove their citizenship, the government investigated people who had been born British subjects because they were born in the empire and who had lived in Britain in some cases for over 50 years. From the 1980s, Britain has explicitly celebrated its diversity through state recognition of cultural difference and through policies formulated on the basis of acceptance of that difference. And so I've included a couple of pictures here of prime ministers of Britain engaged in sort of multicultural celebratory activities. Boris Johnson, very good for a picture, if not much else. But so acceptance of diversity is a part of British public life and political life. And yet, as we see in the Windrush case, that formal recognition of difference exists alongside continued racial exclusion, which is not only experiences discrimination, but results in deportation. So how do we accept, or how do we understand this continued racial exclusion, which occurs at the same time as discrimination and even deportation? This question speaks to the broader interests that animate my book project. In Empire, the Origins of Multiculturalism, I follow the negotiations of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic Britons, and that's the category that they use officially in Britain, and social workers as they argued for the belonging and social rights of Commonwealth citizens during the era of social democracy in Britain. My book does not simply recover migrant past and a valiant campaign for recognition. Rather, in focusing on the negotiation of social rights, I show the ways that welfare served as the grounds for broader debates about citizenship, belonging, and as a vehicle for the emergence of multiculturalism. In doing so, I confront a tendency in histories of Britain to treat race as a static concept, rather than as constituted by economic, political, and social processes. As Stuart Hall argued, to lose the historical context for signifiers of human difference is to essentialize categories and place them outside of change and political struggle. By attending to post-war racial formation, we can understand both how ideas of racial difference were nurtured by the welfare state, as well as the legacies of social democratic racism for the present. And importantly for my research, understanding the post-war racial formation in Britain has to be seen, we have to understand post-war racial formation in Britain as embedded in the empire. My research centers on the history of community relations councils, which were social democratic institutions that sought to bring the whole of local communities together in order to aid the integration of Commonwealth citizens. I follow the rise of community relations councils from local communities organized, local committees organized by social workers. I show the ways that British social workers coordinated with Caribbean social workers and community development organizers, as well as officials of the Pakistani and Indian government to shape their engagements with Commonwealth citizens. And I show how the welfarist principles of community relations gave way after 1968 to cultural recognition. And so I want to see these councils that formed as part of a social democratic response to the problems of Commonwealth citizens. And they were also the means by which imperial modes of cultural governance took place in Britain. And so today I want to share some of my research about how Britain's imperial relations were remade by the welfare state in the years after World War To do so, I'll first give you an overview of decolonization, the changing politics of welfare, and migration. I'll then show how Britain responded to discrimination against migrants from the former empire. Migrants were recognized as Commonwealth citizens with rights. However, their citizenship was undermined by racism. In response, social work organizations emerged to defend Commonwealth citizens' rights. And to do so, they drew upon Caribbean social work and colonial community development. I'll end by focusing in on one particular battle for rights as it played out in the northern city of Bradford. There, Muslim fathers argued for the single-sex education of their daughters. In recognizing the claims of the group on the basis of conservative interpretations of religion, the Yorkshire Community Relations Council chose the group right to determine education by fathers over the individual rights to education of daughters. I'll conclude by reflecting on how the histories of multiculturalism can help us understand the persistence of imperial racial logics and exclusion. So at the close of World War II, we see throughout the British Empire a demand for increased political rights, if not full independence. In response to the pressures of decolonization, in 1948, the British government enacted Commonwealth Citizenship, which formally recognized the right to mobility and a vote in Britain of people from throughout the empire. 1948 also saw the introduction of a welfare state in Britain under the Labour government of Clement Attlee. In addition to specific services, social democracy encompassed a transformation of the relationship between the citizen and the community. From the mid-19th century, under a principle called the Poor Law, to receive welfare in times of hardship, an individual had to give up her membership in the community. After 1948, welfare became a social right of every citizen. The community would guarantee the social security of its members. The presence of Commonwealth citizens in Britain would test the limits of the community of social democracy to include these imperial migrants in its expansive vision of belonging. Before World War II, imperial belonging had been customary, formalized not through citizenship laws, but through a shared culture, especially through affective ties to the monarchy, education, and increasingly through sports such as soccer, rugby, and cricket. These bonds of empire spread not only through the dominions, where ties of heredity and race bound Canadians, Australians, and New Zealanders to the mother country, but to the subject empire as well. And I don't want to say that everyone in the subject empire felt this affinity to Britain, but as you see in this picture, there were many people within the empire who thought themselves to be British subjects and who embraced a kind of imperial Britishness. Colonial subjects as diverse as the liberal politician Dadabhai Naoroji of India and the Marxist intellectual CLR James of Trinidad felt themselves to be part of the British Empire, but this belonging was constrained by two tensions. The first was the importance of ethnographic distinctions to colonial governance, what the South Asian historian Partho Chatterjee has called colonialism's rule of difference. Secondly, imperial belonging was constrained by more exclusive and racially limited ideas of Britishness. These ties of empire were also severely tested during World War II. And I just wanted to point out a couple of things of these two images, both of which were produced during World War II. On the left, you see a map of the British Empire with all of the colonial territories in red, and also the routes between them. And then the image at the top, it shows the kind of political structure of the British Empire, and I'm going to talk about that again in a couple of slides. But you just might see the extent and the scale of the British Empire here, stretching from the Caribbean through Africa, India, Malaysia, and Australia and New Zealand. To wage war against the Germans and their allies, Britain needed to mobilize all of the resources at their disposal, especially in the empire. This recruitment poster on the right implied that the empire was unified, was together in the war effort. But as we'll see, this poster also presents a hierarchy of participation, with soldiers from Canada, Australia, and a sailor from the British Navy at the front of the poster, while a member of the King's African Rifles is at the back. The truth was that the British government also, in addition to creating these distinctions within the war effort, met fierce resistance from a multitude of imperial citizens. The Canadian and Australian governments, whose troops had suffered so much during the First World War, demanded to enter the war on their own terms and to have greater control over the movement of their forces. Canada and Australia, along with New Zealand and South Africa, received formal independence from Britain in 1931 and could make this demand for greater autonomy within the empire. However, the subject empire had no say in the way troops from their colonies would be used in the war. Like so many aspects of political, economic, and social policy, the waging of war was completely out of the hands of the masses of people throughout the empire. And in India, which had seen the rise of an independence movement from the 1880s, but really magnified after 1918, you saw a massive movement to not participate in World War II, and the development of a movement called the Quit India movement, which, as its name implied, wanted the British to immediately leave India. And the beginning of the war saw mass mobilizations in India against the British, and they were put down by aerial bombardment on the part of the British Air Force. And leaders of the Indian independence movement, most of them spent World War II in prison. In India, several anti-colonial movements, particularly the Quit India movement of 1942, demanded immediate British withdrawal from India. Despite the resistance of the leaders of the Indian National Congress to participation in the war effort, 2.5 million men served in the Indian Army, which is the largest volunteer army in history. It was acknowledged between Indians and the British government that this participation would be rewarded with independence at the end of the war. After the war, the British government would have to continue to negotiate between maintaining their economic and geopolitical interests and the claims of anti-colonial nationalism, particularly as over the next 20 years, decolonization generated violence throughout the British Empire. In South Asia, the partition of India and Pakistan on independence in 1947 displaced approximately 21 million people, as individuals crossed the newly formed borders to align their religion and national identity. Partition produced a horrific amount of personal violence and led to some commentators to suggest that this violence was due to inherent and intractable enmity between communities, in the case of India, between Muslims and Hindus. Partition also created a double displacement. This map, those 3 stars on this map of Pakistan, show 3 of the areas where the largest number of migrants to Britain came from, and a significant number of people who eventually migrated to Britain from Pakistan had first been displaced by partition. The era of decolonization also included protracted wars of independence, especially in Malaysia and Kenya. Both of these wars demonstrate the importance of ethnic difference to strategies of colonial governance. In Malaysia, the colonial government discredited the communist Malay Races Liberation Army through the first Hearts and Minds counterinsurgency campaign. In their materials, they emphasized the ethnicity of the MRLA and argued that the minority Chinese could not lead the majority Malays. In Kenya, the British government identified the entire population of Kikuyu as potential Mau Mau insurgents, and thus enemies of the colonial state. Officials attempted to incarcerate all Kikuyu in concentration camps and subjected men, women, and children to torture and brutal interrogation techniques. However, Britain did not only maintain empire through force and the colonial rule of difference. Commonwealth citizenship was enacted in response to these tensions between ethnic difference, national identity, and imperial community. Britain presented an expansive vision of citizenship to demonstrate a commitment to empire through the years of decolonization. And so going back to this chart that I showed you that was created in 1944, the way that the different areas of the British Empire is presented is through this kind of hierarchy or family tree in which the different colonies are organized by their forms of government. And so the dominions at the top are kind of on equal footing with Britain, and because they have a kind of equal standing in the empire. But then what you get down the family tree are areas with less and less elected representation. So Commonwealth citizenship was also a way of transforming this very hierarchical model of empire into one that was presented as more equitable. That is, everyone in the British Empire had the same right to travel to Britain to seek work and welfare on the same terms as people born in Britain. In 1948, the British government passed the British Nationality Act, which created the category of Commonwealth citizenship. Commonwealth citizenship, as I just said, extended to everyone in the British Empire, including native Britons, those in the subject empire in the Caribbean, Africa, Southeast Asia, and even to citizens of the independent countries of India and Pakistan, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa. Commonwealth citizenship was declared equivalent to the status British subject and endowed these citizens with the right to enter Britain freely, to seek work and welfare on the same terms as any Britons, and even to vote in British elections. In addition to addressing the tensions between exclusive national identity and expansive imperial identity, Commonwealth citizenship also responded to Britain's need for labor in the years after World War II. Britain needed labor for physical reconstruction after the damage of World War II German bombing campaigns. Britain needed labor for the expanding institutions of the welfare state, hospitals, schools, universities, and social services. Britain needed labor to keep industrial production high, to pay for the welfare state and the debt incurred to wage World War II. And Britain needed labor because in the years after World War II, more people emigrated from Britain than migrated to it. As a quick example, the post-war British government sponsored the emigration of 140,000 Britons in the first 5 years after the war. Commonwealth citizens were essential to the post-war economy, but their value as labor would not translate to their acceptance in the local communities of Britain. The treatment of Commonwealth citizens in Britain was an imperial issue for the reasons outlined previously, but it was also a domestic issue because Britain's welfare policies made Social Security the right of every citizen. In 1948, the Labour government introduced the welfare state. National assistance and the National Health Service represented a break with the social policies of the past. Through taxation, the community would collectively guarantee a minimum quality of life for the citizen. Even though the state was now providing broad social security, there still remained a need for the voluntary agencies that provided most social services in the pre-1948 era. And these voluntary agencies were the ones who first identified the needs of Commonwealth citizens and created programs to aid them. And that's what I will turn to next. On June 21st, 1948, the SS Empire Windrush arrived in London carrying 1,027 passengers, including 492 Jamaicans. And that number 492 was widely circulated in newspaper accounts of the arrival of the ship, not the 1,027 total passengers, but specifically the number of Black male Caribbean migrants. The visibility of this set of migrants was heightened by the welfare state because it was both a matter of concern that these passengers would not be able to find housing in London and would then create a sort of crisis for the state to have to take care of. And in order to prevent the Caribbean migrants from sleeping on London streets, colonial officials found them accommodation in a deep air raid shelter in Clapham, South London. And so the colonial office paid for their housing for their first week or so that they were in London. And the Ministry of Labor set up a labor exchange there to help them find work. After a few weeks, the Colonial Office could report to their colleagues in other departments of the British state that all of the migrants on the Windrush had found employment. The Windrush, which gave rise to the Windrush Scandal that I spoke about at the beginning of the talk, has been widely mythologized as the beginning of post-war migration to Britain. But as we can see from its arrival, the question of the welfare rights of migrants from the decolonizing empire was central to stories and to the integration of Commonwealth citizens into Britain. Many of the first wave of post-war migrants were ex-soldiers who returned to Britain to re-enlist in the armed forces or who wanted to find work there because of their wartime experiences. They found work in the building trades, reconstructing British cities after the wartime destruction. They found work in mines, manufacturing, public transportation, and also in the expanding welfare state. West Indian nurses were specifically recruited to work in the National Health Service, and the expansion of hospitals, universities, and other state services created employment for Caribbean women, although often in the most menial positions. But despite the fact that migrants desired work, and it was racism that produced unemployment, articles like this one fanned popular perception that migrants from the empire came to Britain to take advantage of white British workers and taxpayers, that they were coming to take advantage of the welfare state. In the early 1950s, without laws against discrimination, racism was an ever-present reality for colonial subjects in Britain. And you can see this photograph in which the letters KBW are written on the brick wall behind these two gentlemen. That stands for Keep Britain White. Migration from the Commonwealth became visible in the mid-1950s, but the numbers of Commonwealth citizens in Britain was never very high. And so here is a graph I've made of the numbers of Commonwealth citizens entering the country between 1955 and 1966. And so I've broken it down by the percentage, by the numbers, depending on where they're from. The Caribbean, India, and Pakistan, which were the three main areas in which Commonwealth citizens traveled from. A note about the numbers, it was actually very difficult to get statistics about how many of these Commonwealth citizens were entering Britain because they entered the country as British subjects. So they weren't distinguished when they arrived in the country from any other British passport holder. That invisibility also became a problem for the state, who wanted to know exactly how many numbers were coming. So then to give you a sense of the percentage of the population this number is constituted, this is a graph that uses census data from 1951, 1961, and 1971 to show the total number of UK citizens with ancestry in the new Commonwealth, which is the category the government used to talk about people from the Caribbean and South Asia. And you can see in total numbers how small it is. And this is a graph of the percentage. It never gets to 2% by 1971. So with such small numbers, I think it's important to ask, why does this become such a huge deal? The discrimination that Commonwealth citizens experienced in their search for housing, jobs, and welfare led them to seek assistance from voluntary social service agencies. The councils Commonwealth citizens would form with social workers advocated on behalf of Commonwealth citizens to employers, local governments, and the offices of the welfare state. Now, most of the history of Commonwealth citizens of migration to Britain has been told from the perspective of London. London, the Imperial Center, and the kinds of encounters that took place there. But I found in my research that it wasn't London that generated the most kind of activity around integrating migrants. It often wasn't necessary in London because of the numbers of migrants there, Commonwealth citizens there, and the kinds of organizations they found. I actually found that it was in Nottingham, which is in the East Midlands, where a form of social work organization emerged that then became duplicated across the country. In 1949, Laurent Philpotts, who's right here, a Royal Air Force pilot during the war and a migrant from Jamaica, wanted to buy a house in Nottingham to convert to a hostel for single Caribbean men. Because of the discrimination faced by Caribbean men, he wanted to create a form of housing when they couldn't otherwise find housing. And he brought his project to Dorothy Wood, a social worker at the Council of Social Service. And she aided him by writing to foundations for financial support, helping him rent furniture, and advertising his hostel through her local and national contacts. In Nottingham, individual encounters like this one between Commonwealth citizens seeking assistance and the Nottingham Council of Social Service generated interest in forming an organization to deal with these individual problems in a more substantial way. So in Nottingham, the Nottingham Commonwealth Citizens Consultative Committee was brought together through the activities of Caribbean migrants, clergymen, businessmen, trade union officials, officers of the local government, town councilmen, and others in the city interested in social welfare. The intention was to bring the whole of the local community together. And the primary organizers were Dorothy Wood, Laurent Philpotts, and Eric Irons, who was also born in Jamaica, had served in the Royal Air Force, and then settled in Nottingham. And so these are some pictures from Nottingham, from particularly the parties thrown by the Nottingham Consultative Committee for Commonwealth Citizens. Parties were a major way that they generated revenue. And then also a newspaper story about the life of Commonwealth citizens in Nottingham. And then this is a story about the mayor being celebrated by the Indian Society in Nottingham. Commonwealth citizens in Nottingham didn't only join the consultative committee, which was meant to bring the whole of the community together, which was an interracial organization. They also had their own societies that were organized by community. So this is Mashriq, the Urdu News Weekly, that also shows similar pictures of local officials coming to spend time with the Pakistani Society. And these are pictures from the Nottingham Sports and Social Club, including their cricket team and a dominoes night at the clubhouse. On starting the consultative committee, the members felt that their work was temporary, helping newcomers find housing and employment, and once they were settled, they would be able to stand on their own 2 feet. However, it soon became apparent that employment problems were intractable. So the consultative committee began to organize information sessions and panels to facilitate the employment of Commonwealth citizens in Nottingham companies. And they organized people from trade unions, from the labor exchange, from different hiring managers at factories, and they operate information sessions to Commonwealth citizens in order to better prepare them for jobs. And the point of these kinds of activities were so that Commonwealth citizens, recent migrants, could learn about British factory conditions, discuss their problems seeking employment, and practice their interviewing skills. For women, they developed different kinds of programs, specifically a housework training school in which they wanted to train female Caribbean migrants in domestic work, to work both in private homes and state institutions. It was incredibly difficult for them to find students for their domestic work classes because women did not travel from the Caribbean to England in order to engage in domestic work. And so a program like this shows us the way that social workers imagine the kinds of employment that was considered appropriate for migrants, and also the way that migrants pushed back on the place that they were being put into the British economy. Despite these efforts, Commonwealth citizens, and of course some Commonwealth citizens did also participate in these programs, But despite their efforts, Commonwealth citizens continued to face charges that they were unsuitable for jobs and stereotypes regarding their abilities. And I found in my research that when the consultative committee probed employers about why they wouldn't hire Commonwealth citizens for jobs in factories, for instance, employers never wanted to say race or discuss race. Instead, they talked about the suitability of the skills of the migrants for the positions available. And something I found in my research is that unsuitability becomes a really important keyword for how Commonwealth citizens are excluded from certain kinds of work. In 1960, Dorothy Wood wrote to a colleague, "There are not really equal opportunities in every case for colored people here. And of course, the employment position is probably at its best just now." The Nottingham Consultative Committee was busy in its work, and yet there was a feeling that the work was never enough. While the work of the Nottingham Consultative Committee was based in the everyday problems of migrants in the city, in London, another site of my research, the Community Relations Councils worked to abstract individual encounters into a standard social work practice. Rather than intervene in everyday issues of work and housing, in London, the West Indian Advisory Committee was a professional organization dedicated to gathering information to explain West Indians to the welfare state. The West Indian Advisory Committee was composed primarily of social workers employed by voluntary and state agencies. Formed in 1956, it was a professional body to share information and advice in order to create best practices. As such, individual social workers reported on conditions in their local areas regarding the relationship between West Indians, White Britons, and local social service agencies. And so this is a survey. This is a survey right here on the left that was taken up by members of the Willesden, I think they were called the Willesden International Friendship Club. And so these are volunteers like the Nottingham Consultative Committee, but instead of doing employment panels, they're doing research about the condition of West Indians in Willesden. And you find this kind of ordinary people engaging in social science research throughout Britain as regards the position of migrants. And this local survey in Willesden finds that attitudes of White Britons towards Commonwealth citizens, that's what they wanted to discover. And the local survey was conducted by the volunteer members of the Willesden International Friendship Committee, and this becomes a source for other consultative committees throughout Britain. These kinds of very ordinary reports become circulated and then get taken up as like very official knowledge. And the study group on the right is similarly a report produced by a group of social workers who are all coming together to share reports of their local communities, the kinds of problems that Commonwealth citizens face, and they bring together this information in order to create workable social work knowledge. Early community relations councils formed through the engagement of older forms of social work with the contemporary problems experienced by migrants in Britain. As in the case of Nottingham, these councils were often initiated by settled Commonwealth citizens, seeking to assist other Commonwealth citizens as they faced discrimination. Social workers like Dorothy Wood increasingly demanded that their professional organizations provide guidelines on how to solve the intractable problems faced caused by discrimination. This fueled the demand for research and the desire to bring social facts to bear on practice with migrants. This demand for social knowledge would be magnified through the partnership of the community relations councils with officers of the governments of the West Indies and Pakistan. So in the first context between social workers and migrants in post-war Britain, social workers attempted to incorporate migrants into their existing frameworks of social work practice. However, increasingly, they turned to the governments of the Caribbean and Pakistan to aid their efforts to secure the social rights of migrants. These partnerships would increasingly lead to the splintering of Commonwealth citizens into distinct cultural communities. And so the key partner that British social workers found was Jamaica Welfare, which was founded in 1937 in response to the labor unrest caused by the Great Depression. Through the advocacy of Norman Manley, the future Prime Minister of Jamaica, a percentage of profits on the banana industry would be provided for the promotion of welfare. In addition to direct services in the capital of Kingston, Jamaica Welfare instituted a program of community development in rural villages throughout the mountainous island. Community development constituted education and village improvement, bureaucratic organization, and self-help principles to prove colonial subjects' readiness for citizenship. In the post-war era, the ideals of community development would be transferred from the villages of Jamaica to the cities of Britain. As the West Indies prepared for independence, the British Caribbean Welfare Service of the Colonial Office became the Migrant Services Division of the federal government of the West Indies. Officials of the West Indian government began visiting Britain to research the conditions of West Indians in Britain. Meanwhile, officers of Migrant Services Division began a program of community development in Britain. The organizer of this project was Edmund Burke III, who traveled to Britain in 1958 as an expert in community development. In London and Nottingham, he initiated leadership courses for West Indians to learn to organize themselves as a community to advocate for their inclusion in Britain. And so this is a schedule from the training program for the leadership course developed by Edmund Burke or Eddie Burke in Nottingham. His leadership course was an exercise in civic engagement and included presentations by officers of the West Indian government and also officers of the local authority in Nottingham. And as you can see, there's a range of topics covered in the course, but the most important aspect of community development for Burke was leadership and creating the ideal leader among West Indian migrants. And so I just think that Burke's idea of a leader is very interesting, and you might particularly love human beings enough to work and make sacrifices without thought of gratitude or sufficient recompense. Show kindness and thoughtfulness to all people, exercise control over himself, thus influencing others to practice self-discipline and restraint. Have an unbounded faith in the ability of the people to think, to try, and to do. Be willing to learn thoroughly one thing at a time and to teach it effectively. Burke's idea of the community that could be organized by a leader was one in which the leader kind of gave of themselves to this project of mobilizing the action of others. And in this, he also had very clear ideas of what was not a good leader. The Lady Bountiful, the dictator, the know-all or encyclopedia, the energy plus who likes to do everything himself, the possessive, and the braggart. Maybe some of you can recognize these types in your organizations. And so Burke was considered to be an incredibly successful community development practitioner in Jamaica. He had been seen to kind of transform the capacity of villages to engage in their own projects of self-improvement. And this was really important in colonial Jamaica because it was a project of anticipatory citizenship. And the ideal of Jamaica welfare was that individuals who could lead their own communities would demonstrate to the British government that they were ready for independence. But if you transfer this kind of project to Britain, what you're saying is that people who already have citizenship and rights have to continue to demonstrate their worthiness for that citizenship and rights. And so one of the things that I've been really interested in thinking about what happens when you bring colonial community development into a situation in which people, just by moving across imperial space, have come into the possession of further rights and local participation. Burke had a very well-defined sense of leadership, one that emphasized optimism. Burke often used a parable from the book of Matthew to explain the qualities of leadership. Rather than imposing a program, the leader should work as leaven in the community, raising the whole loaf through their energies. The Nottingham Experiment, this leadership training course among Caribbean migrants in Nottingham, the Nottingham Experiment had important consequences in Britain. The ideal of community development suffused community relations councils' efforts as they increasingly recognized communities and sought to identify their leaders. Additionally, Migrant Services Division more broadly, particularly through their information services, helped mobilize a West Indian public sphere in Britain, committed to advocating on their own behalf. And so in this slide, you have the West Indian Gazette, which is the most famous of the Caribbean newspapers that were published in England in the years after World War II. And it was edited by Claudia Jones, who was a Trinidadian migrant who had first moved with her family to Harlem in New York. And she was a communist and very involved in communist newspapers in the US. During the McCarthy era, she was deported from the US. And she was not allowed by the colonial government to enter Trinidad because of her potential anti-colonial work that she might do there. So instead, because she was a Commonwealth citizen, she traveled to Britain and she took up leadership in the Caribbean community in Britain. And the West Indian Gazette was a really important newspaper for not only bringing together global decolonization, it brought the news of global decolonization to community events and the situation in politics in London. And so here you see an article written by David Pitt, which is talking about the importance of remittances, payments made by Caribbean migrants in Britain to their families back home. And he uses the example of remittances to critique the colonial state, which has denied development or sufficient economic funds for the colony. And then for the remittances, which amounted to about 4.5 million pounds per year, that was more than 10 years worth of community development funds that the British state was paying in the Caribbean. So the successful partnership between Migrant Services Division through programs like the leadership course in Nottingham and the kinds of advice that their social workers gave to social workers in Britain, it made that idea of partnership seem very appealing to social workers in Britain. And so they sought advice from the High Commission of Pakistan and of India. From 1960, Pakistanis made an increased presence in Britain. Officers of the Pakistan High Commission participated in conferences of social workers organized by community relations councils. So just the way that British social workers looked to Caribbean social workers to organize Caribbean communities in Britain, they turned to the Pakistani government to help them organize Pakistani communities in Britain. So this is a conference for social workers called Pakistanis at Home and in Britain. And the other conference that I have here is called East Meets West, which was taken from a quote from a Rudyard Kipling poem. So even though this is a small glimpse of it, there are ways that imperial ways of thinking about Indians and Pakistanis are filtering through these kinds of collaborations. The participation of the Pakistani government in explaining the culture and social life of Pakistanis joined an increasing sense that to provide appropriate services to Commonwealth citizens in Britain, it was necessary to understand their family life and culture. And so I want to conclude my talk, or I'm moving towards the conclusion of my talk by thinking through one case in which we see the patterns of social work that I've established here have consequences for group and individual rights in Britain. And that's the situation of the education of Muslim girls. And so what I want to focus on for the rest of my talk is a set of issues in Bradford in northern England, in which Muslim fathers started advocating for the single-sex education of their daughters. But whereas the Bradford Education Council, they provided single-sex girls' schools in the 1970s because of the reorganization of schools in Britain, they closed the single-sex schools and they began to have mixed schools. And this created the conditions in which Pakistani fathers began advocating for the single-sex education of their daughters. As was the case elsewhere in Britain, the early 1970s witnessed the culmination of the process of comprehensivization of Bradford secondary schools. One outcome of this process was the closure of all but 3 girls' schools. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to. Was the closure of all but 3 girls' high schools: Catholic St. Joseph's College, Bradford Girls Community Grammar School, and Bellevue Girls School. Each depended on a process of selection for admission. St. Joseph's on the basis of Christian faith, Bradford Girls Grammar School on the basis of an entrance exam, and Bellevue on the basis of geography. One student, Kulsum Banu Patel, was allocated a place at her new local comprehensive Hanson Upper School, but her father argued that she should be given a place at Bellevue Girls School. The council denied his request as a matter of policy. They did not allow for transfer to girls-only schools on cultural grounds. The director of education argued that if they allowed Muslims this request, then Bellevue Girls School would become an all-Muslim school. Patel appealed to Margaret Thatcher, the Secretary for Education at the time, who refused to intervene. He pressed his case until his daughter turned 16 in the summer of 1975, at which point she was no longer required to school. So this one father, he used the kinds of advocacy that were possible to him and made available to him through the kinds of community relations councils I've been talking, to argue for the right of his daughter to single-sex education. And because of the amount of time that he spent arguing for this case, in which he was able to gather a lot of support from others, his daughter aged out of school. So she didn't get the education that she was supposed to have because of her father's argument for her single-sex education. And I really see that this kind of maneuver in which individuals use these community relations councils in order to advocate for certain kinds of welfare rights as a version of communal politics. And really, it's 2 different kinds of communal politics: the local politics of educational provision and the politics of cultural recognition. And Abdullah Patel, Kulsum Banu's father, was able to gain the support of the Yorkshire Committee of Community Relations, a committee like the Nottingham Committee I was talking about before. And the Yorkshire Committee really understood the tensions between these competing views of education. The Yorkshire Committee for Community Relations responded to Kulsum Banu's case with the publication of a discussion paper, The Education of Muslim Girls. The paper not only situated Patel's case in the context of the reorganization of Bradford's secondary education, but also in the different views of political parties towards education. Whereas the conservative government argued for the significance of parental choice, labor-controlled local authorities implemented comprehensive education on the principle of zoning. Margaret Thatcher, the Secretary of Education, sought to overthrow the development of universal comprehensive education to return to the division of secondary schools between elite grammar schools and technical secondary modern schools. So historians have asked us to think about parental choice in terms of the demand for parental voice rather than selection, but parental choice could also be used as a rhetorical strategy to argue for the right to single-sex education for Muslim girls. Muslim parents like Abdullah Patel regarded discussion of parental choice seriously and made their claims to single-sex education on those terms. So the Yorkshire Committee for Community Relations argues that the timing of the girls' transfer to high school occurred in this moment of reorganization, when the nature of schooling in Bradford was kind of up for debate and a heightened sense of conflict over what education in Bradford should be. If the girls attended a single-sex school, or if Bradford only supported coeducational schools, the conflict wouldn't have been necessary. Despite this discussion of contingency and political debate surrounding education, the committee defended Islamic values against British ones. Bradford allowed for students to wear salwar kameez instead of school uniforms, provided vegetarian meals, allowed girls to skip physical education, and allowed Muslim students to skip religious education and school worship. However, The committee argued these measures did not go far enough to allay the fears of Muslim parents. At mixed-sex comprehensive schools, girls not only attended classes with boys, but were exposed to permissive British mores. The author stressed that this was not simply about relationships between boys and girls, but about the pluralistic values now being adopted within schools. The Yorkshire Committee for Community Relations wrote, quote, "Many schools no longer present their pupils with a set of beliefs, values, and attitudes." Excuse me. The Yorkshire Committee for Community Relations wrote, "Many schools no longer present their pupils with a set of beliefs, values, and attitudes which society requires them to accept. Instead, they are invited to discover their own meaning and make their own responses to life in terms of beliefs, morals, and values." The Yorkshire Committee for Community Relations authors pointed to the teaching of D.H. Lawrence's Sons and Lovers and humanism in religious education as examples of the new pluralism. The paper stated, quote, "Muslims often characterize pluralism by the term permissiveness, which evokes the concepts of a society in which rejection of traditional mores is encouraged rather than merely permitted, applauded rather than tolerated, and sometimes reluctantly accepted." Lastly, the Yorkshire Committee for Community Relations sought to explain the context of education in Pakistan that shaped the demand for single-sex education in Britain. They discussed the lack of educational facilities in many Pakistani villages and the ways that boys receive more public education than girls. Many families believed, they suggested, that a girl learned all she needed within the home from her mother. In keeping his daughter at home, the Pakistani father acted in line with not only his religion, but also the social context of the Pakistan he left behind. However, the authors also acknowledge the changing status of women in the rest of the world, including Islamic societies. They recognize the danger if, quote, "British Islam became a decadent expression of their faith and British Muslims a perpetually unskilled element of society." They then sketch the importance of community within Islam, the bonds of reciprocity and honor that govern relations between the sexes and families. They refer to surahs from the Quran to assert the religious basis of Muslim feelings. The Yorkshire Committee explained Islamic culture to secure the social rights of the community. In discussing the possible ways that Muslim parents could educate their daughters in Britain according to their customs and religious faith, the authors emphasized the importance of girls receiving education, preferably with accommodation in British state schools. They urged consultation with citizens in the production of education policy instead of waiting for problems to arise and then asking for input to manage a crisis. They warned that if the city did not take the Muslim demand for single-sex education seriously, girls would be secretly withdrawn from school and become the, quote, "semi-literate mothers of the next generation of Muslim Britons, lacking English themselves and unfitted for life in Britain." They argued that preventing Muslim girls from receiving an education was detrimental not only for the girls, but for British society as a whole. The authors of the report included Abdullah Patel and Muhammad Iqbal, the author of an essay, "Islamic Education and Single-Sex Schools," which argued for the religious basis of single-sex education. By including these members, the Yorkshire Committee sought to work with the Muslim fathers most invested in single-sex education for their daughters. And it was the views of these fathers that formed the basis of the Yorkshire Committee's arguments about the education of Muslim girls. The Yorkshire Committee's embrace of Patel and Iqbal's views prompted a backlash. A review of the education of Muslim girls in the journal Education criticized the committee for parroting extremist beliefs. The comment, entitled "Islam, the Sectarian Threat to Local Education Authorities," diminished the religious arguments in favor of single-sex education by arguing that the controversy surrounding Hosni Banu Patel was a sectarian travesty grounded in a conservative attitude to Islam found in particular in Pakistan and in some parts of the Arab world, notably Saudi Arabia. In the intellectual center of modern Islam, Cairo, It would receive no condemnation because it recognized that the central tradition of Islam has been its willingness to adapt to changing social conditions. The authors of the education comment mobilized an interpretation of Islam against the Yorkshire Committee's claims. They blamed the controversy on the Community Relations Commission, who had abrogated their role to work in the interests of the whole community. The official statement from the Community Relations Commission read, "It is for the Muslim community itself to decide what is required from the educational system." The state commission refused to intervene in a matter of social provision in what it perceived as an internal matter for cultural community. Kulsum Banu Patel did not attend secondary school, but her father's pursuit of single-sex education had further consequences. In 1974, Abdullah Patel organized the Bradford Muslim Parents Association, which became a vocal advocate for parental choice in the schooling of Muslim girls. In 1983, they submitted a request to oversee 5 schools in Bradford as voluntary state-aided schools. However, the Muslim Parents Association did not have the support of the Council of Mosques in Bradford, the Asian Youth Movement, or the students and teachers in the schools they requested to take over. The Bradford Educational Services Committee rejected their application on the basis that they did not have the support of the Muslim community of Bradford. The Muslim Parents Association did not achieve their aims to manage schools. However, I'm almost done, I promise. However, in 1980, Bradford Council agreed to allocate pupils based on parental choice. And by 1984, Bellevue Girls School, the school that the education county worried would become all Muslim, did in fact become over 2/3 Muslim. And so I want to conclude by pointing out a couple of important points of this story. Kulsum Banu's education, I want to situate it in the larger debates around educational provision, as well as the ways in which Commonwealth citizens were imagined to form and participate in community in Britain. The controversy surrounding Kulsum Banu Patel's education gestured to a new politics of community. Her father's desire for her to receive single-sex education represented a demand too extreme to be accommodated by the whole community represented through the Bradford Department of Education. The schools of Bradford accommodated choices of clothing and food and excused Muslim students from Christian-influenced school assemblies based on religious belief, but they would not provide single-sex education on the basis of cultural recognition. For Kulsum Banu, Abdullah Patel did not demand Muslim education, but his basis for demanding single-sex education was on religious terms. The denial of this demand propelled requests for separate Muslim schools. The emergent rhetoric of parental choice provided a way of translating his concerns for a broader audience. The Yorkshire Committee's views on the education and employment of Asian girls and women was shaped by the larger social changes of which they were a part. They intervened in the debate in order to explain the perspective and culture of the Muslim parents who demanded respect for the tenets of their religion. In many ways, Patel worked through the Yorkshire Committee for Community Relations to further his own interests. However, the committee's interpretation of Islam were itself up for debate among Muslims who participated in the committee as well as in the wider discussions of the controversy. When the Muslim Parents Association presented its case to administer 5 schools to the Bradford Education Department, they did not receive the support of the Yorkshire Committee for Community Relations. Separate schools was a step too far. In West Yorkshire, Asian youth represented the ability of the family to persevere through a society in economic and social change. Community Relations Councils conceived of Asian families as caught between 2 worlds. And in the end, they chose the values of the fathers in wanting to retain Muslim education single-sex education for their daughters over bringing girls into the education supported for the broad community. Their efforts represent, the efforts of the Yorkshire Committee for Community Relations represent a lament for the decline of community among Britons, but their embrace of the Asian family would come at the expense of the Asian teenagers. Using the language of parental choice, the Muslim Parents Association demanded accommodation for their religion from the local authority. The Bradford Education Department did not have the resources or the interest in providing single-sex education, prompting the Muslim Parents Association to fundraise for separate schools. By 1984, the Bradford Council stated that there were as many as 1,000 Muslim girls in the city who did not attend school. The parental right to choose trumped these young citizens' right to education. We do not know what Kulsum Banu Patel thought about her education or the decision of her father to remove her from school. The Yorkshire Committee recognized the right of her father, Abdullah, to speak on her behalf through their acknowledgement of his religious background. In Bradford and throughout Britain, the framework of leadership and community established through community relations practice, which favored respectable citizens who could claim to work in the interests of the whole community, broke down. In supporting the most traditional version of the Asian family, the community relations councils contributed to placing Asian girls outside of welfare. It was no longer the work of the local community to ensure the social rights of the citizen, but to instead recognize cultural forms of community. In this process that I've tried to illustrate for you, multiculturalism emerged through the work of community relations, which created a durable structure to identify groups and endow those leaders with authority. In Britain, the imperial history of managing difference was remapped within the domestic nation, and the process by which these imperial formations arrived in Britain often had circuitous roots, as in through the Caribbean. In this account of multiculturalism, I have argued that cultural recognition displays social rights as the grounds of integration. As we now kind of look beyond multiculturalism, I think returning to this history can help us see alternative political projects and alternative visions of community and citizenship, which might be useful for our present and future. Thank you.
We have some time for questions. Would you tell people online if they should just sing out?
If you're with us online, just raise your hand and I can call on you for questions.
So I found this fascinating. Thank you very much. So one of the things I'm thinking about is disaggregating the types of colonial subjects that came to Britain, and specifically wondering aloud about the fact that, that there are selection mechanisms through which individuals came from Jamaica versus from India versus from different parts of India versus from Pakistan, both in terms of class, in terms of professional identity, and also really crucially, I think, the extent to which they were sort of pre-socialized. So I think about sort of middle class and professionals coming out of India who have come through school systems that were quite British already. And so has your research captured at all the sort of differences, in other words, in the openness to assimilation or the capacity to adjust in the different cohorts of immigrants that have come from different parts of colonial Britain into Britain?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And one thing that I would just really like to emphasize is how I think that the histories that I've sort of been trying to assemble here are linked. And so for a lot of historians who study migration in Britain, they often focus on one group. Like they focus on Caribbean migrants to Britain or South Asian migrants to Britain. And what I'm trying to do is assemble a story in which we think about how these groups are being created in relationship to each other. And I'd be happy to talk about the ways that social workers create those distinctions and kind of magnify them through their practice. But in terms of migrants coming from South Asia and the conditions or the ways that they're conditioned to migrate to Britain, I would point to two things. Well, it might be easier if I could scroll back to this map. So some of the migrants traveling to Britain, especially from India, were middle class, and a lot of them took up positions as doctors in the NHS. But many more migrants came to Britain were working class, especially migrants from Bangladesh and Pakistan, and especially migrants from Pakistan, especially the ones from near Azad Kashmir. These are people who had been involved in imperial labor migration for maybe over 100 years. And so these were areas in which steamship companies recruited workers to work as firemen. Basically meant they worked in the furnaces, shoveling coal on steamships in the Indian Ocean world. So this was already an area that experienced outmigration through these kind of imperial processes of labor recruitment. Similarly, in Sylhet in Bangladesh, an area in which a large amount of migrants traveled to Britain, that was another area that had similarly seen out-migration for generations. And what was different in the post-World War II period is instead of working for a time on steamships, for instance, and then returning home, these were migrants who ended up traveling to Britain for work. And many of them who went to Bradford were actually recruited to work in the woolen mills in Bradford. But instead of returning home, because of the changes in the immigration law in Britain, they had their families join them in Bradford. So one of the things, if we think about immigration policy in this time period, immigration policy, if the border didn't close for migrants from the empire in the 1960s, there may not have been a long-term multi-generational population of South Asians in Britain, because the largely male migrants who arrived in the 50s and 60s may have returned home. But because of immigration restriction in the 1960s, instead of returning home, they sent for their families to join them in Britain. And so I think that we need to think about labor migration as part of a longer history of labor and imperialism, and also that these migration patterns are fundamentally shaped by laws that restrict migration and that people are trying
Not so much a question, but as someone who comes from West Yorkshire, I just wanted to thank you for providing such a amazing overview of.
I have some really good pictures of Yorkshire that I couldn't put in my talk, but here I will share them because I loved going to Bradford and doing research there. So here's, there was a photographer who went to Bradford in the 1970s and just took a ton of pictures. Neil Hodge, Nick Hodge, I think. But here's a picture of Bradford. Like you probably have not seen the chimneys actually like working.
Right.
But you haven't seen, this is a picture of Bradford with all the mills and the chimneys going.
I
but
wasn't
they don't.
around in 97.
Yeah. I know, but it doesn't look like this anymore. Like the chimneys are there, but you would never see smoke coming out of them. Yes.
Has the percentage of the British population that is has that increased?
Well, the number of migrants has decreased. Like new migrants coming into the country has really decreased from the British Empire from the mid-1960s when immigration restriction was introduced. But of course, the descendants of those migrants were not migrants, but members of South Asian or Caribbean communities continue to live in Britain. But Britain continues to have a population that is maybe 10% non-white, 10 to 12% not white.
You mentioned that it was really hard to find population-based statistics that were racially discriminated against. How did you end up finding the data for that chart you mentioned? Can you like go over your research process a little?
Yeah, great question from a true historian, checking up on the footnotes. So this was a huge issue for social researchers in the period because Commonwealth citizens were British subjects and they weren't counted at the border. They weren't counted by the state until the introduction of immigration restrictions. So it was a really big debate about how they would be registered at the border. So these are numbers from Sheila Patterson, who was a social anthropologist who wrote some of the most important early research on migrants from the Caribbean particularly, but then immigration in general. And it's her kind of unofficial estimate based on state estimates of the population.
And the state estimates are those through census or?
No, it's kind of, so one of the ways that colonial officials kept track of the numbers of people arriving was the passenger lists of boats traveling from the Caribbean or planes arriving at London Airport. So these numbers are incredibly uneven because there's no identifying information on those passenger lists of the races of the people involved. And so this really becomes like a problem of state legibility of migration and of race, because they want to know about race, but they don't want to name that they want to know about race, which kind of creates this problem. And Britain doesn't, in the census, Britain doesn't ask about race until 1981, I believe, in anticipation of the 1971 census. They wanted to, some people wanted to institute a question about race in the census, and there were debates about it. They decided not to, but 1981, I believe, was the first year in which they asked about race in the census. Yes, and then.
What, if any, are the parallels for us here in America?
Good question. So I was in a class this afternoon talking about Enoch Powell, who was a British conservative politician from the 1960s who was very anti-immigrant, and he said that people should not use American examples to talk about Britain because the two cases were separate. But what I think is maybe useful about this history for the US is that we live in a context in which multiculturalism is in a way taken for granted, but we don't often ask about where does multiculturalism come from and what kind of alternate political imaginations can we create? Because it often seems that just recognition of cultural rights, of difference, as a kind of important way of bringing about inclusion and potentially even equity. But I think that what my study suggests is that multiculturalism was only one possibility that came out of these struggles for social rights in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and that we can think about how different ways of thinking about inclusion, not least of all the kind of economic programs that social workers were trying to create, or the different kinds of housing programs that they were also trying to create to kind of work around discrimination. We could think about other ways of thinking about creating a more equitable society. Maybe multiculturalism, in a lot of ways, it contributes to it contributes to making invisible certain kinds of conditions by saying we should want this other thing, recognition. Yes, Bill.
So you made the point that one of the reasons why Britain wanted migrants to come to the country was to deal with the labor shortage of the 50s. Right? And I kept thinking about the German context, which was very similar. The Germans invite lots of Southern Europeans, they invite Turks, right? And all of that seems to go pretty well because they're expecting that these people will eventually go home.
They're guest workers.
Correct. But they don't really undertake any policy in that direction until the first big economic crisis of the mid-1960s. So I'm wondering what happens in Britain that makes them introduce these laws you described that stop immigration. To what degree is it economic, and to what degree is it cultural?
Really good question. And I would say that the first law to reduce immigration from the Commonwealth, but which doesn't eliminate it, is in 1962. And the first calls for this immigration restriction began in the mid-1950s, around the time of that article that I shared about Britain becoming a sponger's paradise. So the first demands for immigration restriction are very much on economic grounds, or at least it's about the conflation of belonging and social rights. So the argument is these people don't really deserve to be here in Britain. They aren't entitled to the same rights as we are. And so I would say there's a cultural and an economic argument at play there. But the calls for immigration restriction in this moment are still fairly small. What really mobilizes increased sentiment towards immigration restriction are the 1958 Nottingham and Nottinghall riots, which are white riots against mostly Caribbean, but also Pakistani migrants in the summer of 1958, August 1958. And what that example shows white people in Britain, is that that a growing group of non-white Britons will inevitably create conflict. And I think that people in Britain are kind of conditioned to anticipate racial difference creating conflict because of imperial experiences. And so there are many people who argue against immigration restriction and argue for the continuation of unrestricted migration from the Commonwealth, but their voices are increasingly marginalized and the calls for immigration restriction grow. Yes.
Thanks, Radhika, for the talk. It's great to hear your work and see the work that you produce is coming. And I loved a couple of terms that you used, such as like imperial belonging and thinking through this particularly notion of cultural recognition. And you cite Stuart Hall early on. So this, of course, makes me think about culture as sites of contestation. And I'm wondering if you could speak to anything about how, how culture gets fixed or made static, while at the same time, you talked about how imperial belonging is about an embracement of British subjectivity that, now you have all these immigrants coming in, their culture is also changing in relationship to the British Empire and in ways that the British Empire's culture might be shifting and changing in relationship to their arrival. But it seems like the recognition makes it like, this is what Muslims do, and that's it, right? And so I'm wondering if you could speak to kind of contestations over culture that happen in your project.
Yeah, so part of talking about this institutional structure of community relations is thinking about what is the framework in which different groups become sort of legible, and in which different ideas of who these groups are and what their culture is become legible, and as you say, a bit more static. But what I wanted to really do in that example of education in Bradford is to show that there was always contestation about what sort of Muslim education or girls' education in Muslim communities would look like. But what we see in that situation is that the Yorkshire Committee for Community Relations chooses one argument over others as more legitimate, example of sort of a Muslim position on girls' education. And so for me, the way I look to Stuart Hall is to think about, well, what are the kinds of contestations that are producing these accounts of culture? What is making them gain a kind of common sense legitimacy? And how can we think about this kind of question, which is often, if we think about Muslim culture, and especially the place of women in Muslim communities, I think that in sort of European history and anthropology, it's about critiquing this idea that there is a static notion, or that the situation is completely internal to these communities. But what I'm trying to show is actually this, the choice to say that girls should have same-sex education is not just about a Muslim demand, it's about the way that demand is operationalized within this context of changing social work provision and contestations over who has authority to speak for the communities. So I would say that is how I'm thinking about culture, and also, but how it is completely situated within these political frames.
So in that way, it's like the rhetorical deployment of culture as an argument strategy, and which one gets taken up, right? So if we think about it in the US context, like 5 years ago, you make an argument against ethnic studies, it didn't get picked up about hating America, but you call it critical race theory and everyone's freaking out. And that's like a big same kind of argument that's happening. But it's like which ones get read as legible versus not legible by state institutions.
Yeah, and it might be like, what is the kind of contingent historical moment in which CRT can take off, and wonder what conditions does it not really gain traction. It's not really about what CRT is. It's about how like the context around it have changed.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes. Whichever one of you like to go first.
Sort of connected to that, but it's sort of fascinating, and there's also in the modern context, this idea that the fight comes down to education programs. Part of it is that layers of patriarchal power, right, that we are then allowed to be framed as repressive choices. It's kind of interesting that's what becomes the focal point.
Well, yes, but I wouldn't want, and I wanted to share this example, but I couldn't really kind of flesh out some of the other ways that I've been thinking about it. But a really important part of this story, I think, is conservative English women. And conservative English women are kind of mobilizing in this era of permissiveness and feminism in order of supporting kind of traditional, what they see as traditional family values among different Asian communities, especially Muslim communities. So, so what I found in my research in Bradford is actually that English women have a really important role to play in looking to Asian communities in general, and particularly Muslim families, and seeing a kind of lost world. They're kind of mobilizing this idea that these migrants, they have cultural values that English people have lost. And so I wouldn't want to say that it's just about patriarchal authority, because there's a really important story for the role that white women play in kind of in thinking about their own ability to interact with these groups, and also what they see as valuable in their ways of life.
One more question.
Oh, there's one behind you, and then you go.
I was curious about like potential comparison with her interaction with the French case. This was right next door, and wondering if you came across anything that indicated like what made the difference in between Britain, where it's a case of the local political agency recognizing or even sort of reifying this whole difference in a public space. The difference between that and then the French case, where in the public space was like unitary enforcement of European identity and erasure among immigrants from the French Empire.
Yeah, that is a really great question. And there's actually been some really amazing work done recently about kind of similar social work organizations, like the ones I study in Britain, emerging in France to work with like Algerian families, especially in like the 1950s and 1960s. And what I find interesting in that literature is that the similar kinds of welfare organizations, they are very invested in rewarding and recognizing Algerian mothers in terms of French motherhood. So like in France, in post-war France, they have these like medals for mothers. And so it's very exciting for these social workers when they feel like they can nominate or like bring to the attention Algerian French mothers to receive these French awards. So you're very right in that the terms of recognition there are their ability to kind of be recognized as French mothers. But I found something different in Britain, and maybe there are different kind of trends in the French case, and in that, like English women in Yorkshire, they very much like appreciate and want like Asian families to kind of stay Asian, or they want them to be able to manage the transition in a way that allows them to continue to keep sort of cultural forms that they find have value. And so one of the things that I've also noticed is that alongside the kind of friendship organizations that English women create to like extend friendship to Asian women and Muslim women is a lot of anxiety about these women joining the workforce. So there is a concern to, in a lot of ways, among these social work organizations in Yorkshire particularly, to also keep the Asian family stable. And one of the reasons to do that is to keep Asian women work in the home and to not seek work. And that's also produced by anxieties about employment and deindustrialization in this period. So I know I haven't fully answered your question about the French versus British example, but I hope I provided a little bit more detail about why the British path might be different, or what some of the kind of contexts are that are shaping the social work response to Asian women.
Let's say thank you very much.
Oh.